Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Montreal. We're here for the start of the assembly of the International Civil Aviation Organization, where IATA has presented or is presenting a number of papers for discussion. Today, we're joined by our Director General, Willie Walsh, who will provide an overview of the current industry situation, some of the agenda topics that we have with ICAO, and then, as normal, we'll throw it open for questions and answers using the chat function. So without further ado, Willie, over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and good morning from Montreal. As Tony said, we're here on the occasion of the 41st General Assembly of ICAO. I think a lot of expectations for developments out of the Assembly, and certainly we'll be very interested to see how the global government community can come together to assist the industry in achieving our goals, particularly in relation to climate change. But maybe just for context, remind you of what the industry has gone through over the last few years and where we currently are. So if you can move to this slide, you can see dreadful couple of years. Good news is we are making progress, but when you see the losses in 2020, 2021, and indeed this year, where we're still expecting losses in the order of 10 billion US dollars. So the industry will have lost around 190 billion US dollars in the 3 years since this pandemic has started. And it is interesting if you go back and just look at the chart there between 2010 and 2019. I think that was the first time the industry had made profits at an operating level consecutively in 10 years, the best 10 years of the industry's history. And interesting, if you look at that, the average margin over that period was 5.5%. And you compare that to the margins in the last 3 years, minus 29%, minus 1.8% in expected in this year. So very, very tough time, but I think great credit to airlines to have been able to manage through this crisis, and it demonstrates the resilience of the industry. And just moving on now, if you look at what we're seeing this year, it's expected that the US industry will be profitable. Again, these are net margins, so margin as a percentage of revenue. The rest of the global industry lagging behind the US, but making good progress. I think Asia Pacific, unfortunately, will continue to lag the rest of the industry given the ongoing border restrictions that exist there. But I think this chart highlights the impact that border closures have had, because the US industry, as many of you will know, has a strong domestic network, which was largely untouched by government regulations or closures through the period. So it's mainly international travel that has significantly suffered. And moving on to next chart, you can see that I think in this display here, cargo has been resilient throughout. We've highlighted this on a number of occasions. I think the importance of the industry being able to pivot its operations from primarily a passenger-focused industry to a cargo-focused industry to ensure that critical supplies remained available throughout the period, I think demonstrates how important this industry is to the global supply chain. The demand for cargo has been quite strong and remains resilient throughout the period, slightly down in July, and I would expect that to be the same in August, about 3%. And you can see the difference between international in blue on the bottom there and domestic in red on the top. We've seen domestic recover strongly in July. And again, I think the same will be true of August. And that's principally the recovery of the Chinese domestic market as the internal restrictions within China were relaxed. So good progress being made on international travel. You can see there we're at about 68% of where we were in July of 2019. And if you consider that in 2021, international travel was at about 25% of where we were in 2019, it shows that international travel has been recovering strongly through this period into the northern summer period, where you would expect traffic demand to be strong. So this chart really does reinforce our view that border closures did nothing to prevent the spread of the virus, but had a massive impact on international travel. And as soon as those restrictions at the border were removed, we saw a strong recovery. Now, as I mentioned, the Asia-Pacific region is lagging behind. We see international travel within Asia-Pacific still only at about 25%, and that plays into the pace at which it will recover. So this shows our latest forecast in terms of when do we get back to 2019 passenger figures. So you can see Africa we're expecting in 2025, Asia Pacific 2025, Europe in 24, so we should be ahead of 2019 in 2024. Latin America and Caribbean 24, Middle East 24, North America the strongest 23, and globally 2024. Clearly, the biggest impact going into next year will be what happens in China and whether China starts to relax the situation. And the situation in China, coupled with some of the economic headwinds that we're witnessing at the moment, has made our latest forecast slightly, very, very slightly less optimistic than we had previously looked at. But in the main, we are still looking at a global recovery in 2024 with good progress being made in 2022 and into 2023. And the next slide. This shows just one of the headwinds that we're facing at the moment. I think everybody will be familiar with the rising oil price and the impact that energy prices will have on consumers. And what you see here is in red the crude oil price in Brent, and in blue the jet price. And this is a very unusual development. Starting at the beginning of this year, we saw what we call the crack spread, the difference between the Brent or the crude price and the price of jet, widen very significantly. And although we have seen crude prices ease in recent months, we're still seeing elevated prices for jet fuel. Now, some of that is understandable, given that the demand for jet fuel reduced significantly in 2020 and 2021. So refining capacity moved away from jet. But as that capacity came back online, we would have expected to see this crack spread narrow significantly. It's still at rates that are significantly elevated from historical rates, which you can see they're going back to 2015 on this chart. But indeed, if I look at that period between 2010 and 2019, the average spread was about 18%. So Brent averaged $80 a barrel through that 10-year period, and jet was 18% more expensive. We've seen, as this chart demonstrates, we've seen that spread go over 60%, and indeed at the end of September it was at 56%. Now it has eased a little bit, but still very, very big difference between crude prices and jet prices, which means that we will see costs continue to challenge the industry in 2022 and in 2023. And just maybe to comment briefly on what we expect from the Assembly, the main focus for us will be on what ICAO calls their long-term aspirational goal. I think, as most people are aware, the industry through IATA agreed to target net zero in 2050 at our AGM in October of last year. I think a very significant and ambitious target for the industry, but we have now aligned ourselves with the science and with the ambition of the Paris Agreement, and we will be looking to ICAO to get the global governments and regulators equally aligned and to agree on their long-term aspirational goal of net zero in 2050. I think anything shy of that and this Assembly will be viewed as a failure. So while You know, some of these targets are ambitious and the expectation is high. I think we have to be realistic that in the current environment, anything short of ICAO agreeing to that long-term aspirational goal of net zero in 2050, I think will be a huge disappointment. It's not going to stop us continuing on our road to net zero in 2050, but I think it would send a very important signal to governments and would help to ensure that we get the right policy framework in place to assist the industry in its ambition. Clearly, we see sustainable aviation fuels as being a key driver to achieving our goals. We need to see more production and widespread availability of sustainable aviation fuels. I've said on many occasions that it's absolute nonsense to believe that you need to incentivize the industry or force the industry to buy sustainable aviation fuels. We're buying every single drop of sustainable aviation fuel that we can get our hands on. What really needs to happen now is governments need to incentivize the production of sustainable aviation fuels. We need the traditional fuel suppliers to turn their attention to sustainable fuels. And you know, it's great to see some new entrants in the market, companies like Neste, who are producing sustainable fuels at volume and have ambitions to do so going forward. But we really do need to see a greater emphasis on the production of sustainable fuels. We need governments to come together and to incentivize and provide the right framework to ensure that we get greater production of sustainable fuels. And that will be absolutely key, given the time available to achieve net zero by 2050. Sustainable fuels really do represent the best opportunity and a very exciting opportunity, not just for us in the airline industry, but it should be seen as an exciting opportunity for governments and countries right across the world. So on that, I'll pause and hand back to Tony, and we can take your questions.
Great, thank you very much, Willie. We have a few questions in the queue. I'll just remind everybody that we will accept questions through the Q&A function, the chat function on the Teams website. And we are here at ICAO, so we'll try and give priority to the ICAO related questions, but I see there are also lots of non-ICAO related questions, so we'll try and get to as many of those as we can as well. We'll start with a first question referencing LTAG and the expectation of a 2050 net zero agreement being achieved at the Assembly. The questioner asks, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most optimistic, how optimistic are you that the Assembly will be able to achieve that agreement?
That's a great question. I'm probably at a 4 in terms of optimism, but if the question was asked how important is it on a scale of 1 to 5, I'd say it's a 5. As I said, it won't stop the industry moving to achieve our target, but it would really provide a strong signal from governments that they are aligned with the ambition of the industry, aligned with the science behind the climate change. And more importantly, I think it will provide the right signal that we need a good framework and policy decisions that will support that goal. So I'm optimistic. You know, as I said, I recognize there are challenges to reaching a global agreement on that, but given the importance of the issue, particularly in the current environment, I think it would be a very, very positive signal from governments if they were to agree to the ICAO long-term aspirational goal of net zero by 2050.
Okay. We have a kind of a follow-up question on that. The questioner says that IATA has been very clear with its target for 2050 and the path towards getting there, but he's wondering the ICAO term aspirational goal and whether that is sufficiently strong to be conclusive and satisfy the industry's requirements.
I think that's a very good observation. It disappointed me when I saw aspirational there, you know, a long-term aspirational goal rather than long-term goal. I think it reflects the difference between the focus that a commercial business would have and what a government entity would have. We're definitely more driven and clearer in terms of our ambition here. But I think it is a very positive first step. I mentioned when CORSIA was agreed that I thought that was an excellent first step. I didn't think CORSIA was going to be the be all and end all, but I thought it was a great first step to get a global agreement on a framework, a single policy issue to address offsetting, to give credibility to offsetting while it becomes important. Recognizing, however, that the long-term ambition that both the industry has and I think that government should have is to use in-sector reductions in carbon rather than, if you like, out of sector. So I'll take it if we get agreement on long-term aspirational goal of net zero in 2050. I think an excellent first step. And I think once that hurdle is cleared, then I've no doubt that it will become a much hardened target by governments right across the world. So I would see it as an important and positive first step for the industry.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of regional questions on the concept of LTAG. One comes from Africa, and the questioner says, with the reliance on fossil fuels and the cost of an energy transition, is it realistic for African airlines or the African industry to be able to achieve net zero?
I think it is realistic for all of the industry, and I think it's wrong to differentiate between regions in the way that maybe we would. When you look at the financial performance, even in the richest parts of the world, or in the the areas of the world where airlines have been doing well historically from profitability, margins there are still very, very small. The idea that this is an industry where some make huge profits and others huge losses, I think that's no longer the case. That probably would have typified the industry in the 70s and the 80s. But we have seen a significant performance in the global industry's financial performance, a significant improvement in that over the last, certainly over the last 10, 15 years, taking the recent pandemic aside. I think the benefit of this transition to net zero and the path that we've identified through the use of sustainable aviation fuels is important, because countries should look at this as an opportunity where they need no longer be dependent on importing fossil fuel, when in fact they will have the opportunity to develop their own sustainable fuel, initially through biofuels, but as the technology improves, through even more sustainable, what we call e-kerosene. So I think there's a real opportunity for countries here. There are multiple pathways available today to produce sustainable aviation fuels. This gives countries an opportunity to develop new industries with good quality jobs, producing a sustainable fuel and reducing their dependence on importing fuel. So, if I was looking at this from a, what's the opportunity out there, I would see this as a big opportunity for African countries. It's going to be a challenge for everybody. We shouldn't underestimate the cost of transition is going to be difficult for all airlines. But it is an issue that working together, ensuring that we can, as an industry, demonstrate that when these sustainable fuels are produced, we will buy them, and that is the opportunity, as I say, that exists for countries and airlines going forward.
Okay, thank you. We also have a regional question coming to us from China. And the questioner says that the China Air Transport Association has put out a statement saying that carbon neutral growth by 2050, carbon neutral growth by 2020, the CORSIA mechanism and the long-term aspirational goal will come with competitive distortions that will disadvantage developing countries. And the questioner asks if we agree with that and what our comments might be.
No, I appreciate the view being expressed by China, and indeed the Chinese members of IATA have been consistent in their approach to this. I think it's important to say that the industry in China has equal ambition. You know, they are determined to achieve net zero. Their time frame for doing so has been slightly different to align with the Chinese government, which is net zero by 2060. I've always said that I would expect that ambition to improve and to harden. And the one thing that you can say about China is that when they set goals, they will achieve them. You know, the industry is not a level playing field. Let's be clear on that. You know, we don't have a level playing field today. Will this provide additional distortion that will make it difficult? I don't believe it will do so. You know, it does make it challenging for everybody. Even within regions, it's going to be more challenging for some, depending on the aspiration that the individual airline has in terms of its growth. And I think these are being recognised and addressed through the debate that's going on in ICAO. And I think it will be interesting to see how that develops over the next few days and certainly into next week. But I think this is too important an issue. You know, we in the airline industry have recognised that for us to grow into the future, not only do we need financial sustainability, which has been a challenge historically for the industry, but we need environmental sustainability and viability. So the two go hand in hand, and I think it represents an opportunity for airlines to remodel their business to ensure that they can achieve both of these ambitions, recognizing that today fuel is the single biggest element of an airline's cost base. So anything that we can do to improve our efficiency through the better performance of aircraft, the better performance for air traffic control, all of these issues become very important. And I think that's why this aspirational goal becomes important as well, because I think this will remove the protection that some of the suppliers in our chain have had. You know, the inbuilt inefficiency in air traffic control systems globally is a disgrace. And, you know, we see politicians encouraging and sometimes criticizing the industry for not being more ambitious, while at the same time, these same politicians have done nothing to address the structural inefficiency in air traffic control systems. And we see, for example, even in the case of France, only last week, air traffic control strikes disrupting the flow of traffic, forcing airlines to bypass French airspace, thereby increasing the fuel that they burn and increasing the generation of CO2. Disgraceful behavior. And, you know, this should not be tolerated. You know, we should have a situation because from a technical point of view, we do have the ability to overfly areas that are being disrupted by strikes where the provision of service can be given by other service providers. So, you know, the situation I think is too important to ignore. And while there may be some distortion to the market, I don't believe it's something that will necessarily create a significant hurdle for airlines.
Okay, thank you, Willie. We have another follow-up question while we're on the topic of China, and the questioner asks, can there be an agreement if China is a holdout?
I believe there can. You know, the important issue here is we're focusing on international aviation. The Chinese market is very important, but it's principally a large domestic market. And in fact, we've seen that in the figures that we've been showing over the last couple of years, where China in effect is closed to international travel because of the border restrictions, although there are some flights. It's very, very few compared to where we were in 2019. But even at a global level, international flying to and from China is still relatively small, whereas the domestic market is huge. So China can deal with their domestic market as they see best, and will certainly do that. So if you look at the contribution that China makes to global CO2, most of that comes from their domestic market, which is significantly larger than the CO2 that they produce from their international flying. And I think that's an important thing to recognize. So when we look at say, for example, 2019, where the global industry produced about 914 million tons of CO2, about a third of that came from domestic flying, which is not covered by either CORSIA, because CORSIA deals with international aviation, or this long-term aspirational goal, is principally an international issue as well as domestic, but CORSIA deals with international travel rather than domestic travel.
Okay, thank you. We'll stick with another couple of questions on environment, and then we'll move to some other topics. We have a questioner who notes that EasyJet is dropping offsets, and you're stressing of the role of SAF in achieving net zero. And the question is, with those developments happening or those statements being made, do you think that CORSIA is becoming obsolete, and will this be in any way reflected at ICAO's discussions?
No, CORSIA is not becoming obsolete, and I think you've got to differentiate between what EasyJet was doing, and I think they deserve credit for their initiative. But what airlines will do under CORSIA is very different. The criteria around CORSIA qualifying offsetting is very, very strict, and the procedures around monitoring and verification equally strict. So what we have is a global scheme, highly regulated, top quality, audited. So you can prove that where the money is going and money is being spent is generating the right result. And I think while some offsetting schemes in the early stages of the concept of offsetting were questionable, and I wouldn't hesitate to say that in some cases very questionable, I don't think that applies to CORSIA, because what you have here is a quality system where the criteria to qualify for offsetting under CORSIA is of a very high standard, and everything will be properly recorded, properly measured, properly verified, audited. And I think that's very important, particularly when it's being done on a global basis. So I see the two issues being very, very separate, and I remain optimistic about CORSIA. As I said, when it was agreed, I thought it was a very positive first step. I didn't think it would be the end goal, but I thought it was very positive because you got a global agreement, and extremely difficult to get governments right across the world to agree to anything, to be honest with you. We saw that just recently with this pandemic. We saw nearly every country going their own way, even in areas like the EU, where you would have expected greater coordination. There was a total lack of coordination in the early stages. So to get countries right across the world coordinated and agreed on an offsetting scheme for aviation, I think was a great achievement, and provides the first step in the way to the industry's goal of net zero by 2050.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll take one last question on climate change, and then we'll move to some other topics. This question asks whether the Assembly could agree to a SAF mandate, and whether that would, if that were the case, would that be on airlines or would that be on manufacturers?
Well, I'm very clear on this. I think what we need to do is to create an environment where more SAF is produced. So therefore, the policy framework we want is where the production of sustainable aviation fuels is incentivized. I think there's a great opportunity to create a new industry that not only generates good jobs, but is very positive for the environment. And I think there's very good reason why we should expect governments to support that industry and to put the right policy frameworks in place to incentivize the production of SAF. Mandating airlines to buy something that isn't available makes no sense, absolutely no sense whatsoever. Airlines have demonstrated that they will buy SAF, because even with the very significant price differential between sustainable fuels and traditional kerosene, airlines bought every single drop of sustainable fuel that was produced in 2021, every single drop, and would have bought more if it was available, and will do the same in 2022. So you don't need to mandate the airlines to buy it. Airlines will buy the product if it's made available. And that's even where it's available at prices that are 2 to 3 times, in fact, 2.5 to 3 times the price of kerosene. So despite the financial challenge facing airlines, they have continued to demonstrate their commitment. So get more production, airlines will buy it. And I can guarantee you, you will not see a situation where SAF is produced and not acquired by the industry, because I know from talking to airline CEOs that they're looking for more sustainable fuels. So mandating the industry to buy a product that currently isn't available makes no sense. What we need, and that's why this ICAO assembly is so important, what we need is the right policy framework in place so that governments incentivize the production of this, so that we can demonstrate we're all working together to achieve an environmental goal that is absolutely critical.
Okay, thank you. So Willie, we've talked a lot about the environmental elements that are being discussed here at ICAO, but we have a question asking, is there a broader agenda or an agenda outside of environment that we're hoping ICAO will make some decisions on?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of issues. Please forgive us if we focus on the environment, because it is such a critical assembly for the environment, given this focus on the long-term aspirational goal. So, naturally, we will be paying most of our attention, and personally, nearly all of my attention will be focused on that. But yeah, there are lots of other things. We want to ensure that ICAO comes together and learns the lessons from the reaction of governments to the pandemic. We've clearly been critical of the way governments responded to the pandemic through border closures. At IATA, we've demonstrated that these measures did nothing, absolutely nothing, to stop the spread of the virus, while imposing huge financial, economic harm on the airline industry and other associated industries, tourism, and all related activities. So I think, it would be remiss of governments not to stand back and try and learn from what worked well and what didn't work well. WHO, from the very beginning, advised governments not to close their borders. I think there's, a lot that we can, if we're honest with one another, there's a lot that we can do to ensure that when these issues arise in the future, and I've no doubt that there will be other pandemics, that we take good decisions based on data, based on science, and based on what we've learned from this one. So I think, again, a very important issue for ICAO. We're also clearly, as an industry, addressing the issue of how we can attract and retain talent. And I think that these two go hand in hand. The reaction of governments to the pandemic and retaining and attracting talent are actually very much aligned, because a lot of people left the industry as a result of the downturn and the changes that airlines were forced to make, and the industry is certainly viewed as less attractive, mainly because I think people in the industry, or who might have looked at the industry, are sort of saying, well, what happens if we get another one of these? Our government's going to do the same thing again, and will my job be put at risk as a result of political decisions that have been influenced by things other than the science? So, making sure that as an industry we can grow financially, that we have financial sustainability, that we have the right talent going forward is very important, because that goes hand in hand with our financial sustainability and our environmental sustainability. So all of these issues will be important, and I think there's some critical issues that ICAO will be focused on over the next 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a non-ICAO issue, which is concerning currency. So there are a couple of questions in this area. One notes that the CEO of Virgin has criticized the UK government for tanking the pound through its economic policies. The questioner asks, what do you think about how important a strong UK economy is for global aviation? And the other is a more general question on the impact of currency volatility, notably the strength of the dollar and the weakness of the pound.
Yeah, currency volatility is something we deal with all the time. Shai at Virgin, great guys, doing a great job there. And I think his criticism is well-founded, particularly the additional challenge that it will create for his company, given that he will have a lot of sterling revenues, but significant dollar costs. So when you get volatility like we've seen in recent days, and I'm sure most airlines will have some currency hedging in place, but the volatility of the sterling dollar combined with the volatility of the oil price definitely makes it much more challenging for airlines based in the UK who have strong sterling revenue bases but strong dollar cost bases. So not just Virgin, but all of the airlines there. So I have a lot of sympathy for him. I think it's going to be a challenging time there. But we've dealt with these issues before. Well, I spent 20 years, more than 20 years as an airline CEO. I've never been able to figure out what's the best exchange rate between sterling and the dollar or euro and the dollar, and these airlines deal with multiple currencies. So dealing with currency volatility is part of the day job to some degree. It's very frustrating when you see these knee-jerk government responses to some of the challenges that they face, and clearly in an effort to make themselves look popular with the electorate, taking decisions that have massive economic impact on companies. I'm not sure that all of these policies were thought through carefully, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But currency volatility makes the job of an airline CEO even more exciting and more challenging, and that's particularly true of what we've seen in the last week or so for airlines based in the UK.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back to some pandemic questions. So the first question I have asked simply, is the pandemic over, and have governments realized that, if that's the case?
Well, I think the pandemic is largely over. The virus clearly isn't, and that means it's still having an impact on industry. People are still contracting the virus. So if I look at this just from a day-to-day operational issues, I think it's important that people recognize that there are jobs where you cannot expect an employee who has become ill to continue to work. Many people say it's just a cold, you can continue to work. You don't want your pilots or cabin crew or ground personnel, working in an environment like that. So I think it's having an operational impact still for many airlines around the world, which is adding to the challenges that they've faced in the ramp up of activity as the demand has clearly been very strong. So the issue of whether we should still have border closures and some of the restrictions, I think those measures have long since passed their sell-by date. We had encouraged the removal of these restrictions many months ago, and I'm pleased to say that that is the case in many countries. I think it's still frustrating for consumers to try and figure out some of the rules. I've done some flights recently where you're told you have to wear a mask, you get on board and you're told you don't have to wear a mask, or you get to the airport and you're told that a mask on this flight, you have to wear one. So I flew from Munich to Montreal yesterday. You had to wear a mask. The crew were excellent, I have to say. They said, look, we're sorry, but you still have to wear a mask under German government regulations, but it's only until the end of the month. At the end of the month, you won't have to wear it. And you sort of sit there and you say, well, why do I have to wait until the end of the month when the rest of the world has largely dispensed with wearing these masks? So I think it is frustrating for people. It would be great to see greater coordination in relation to this. And I think this is where governments have lost the support of their people when they see decisions being taken, implemented, retained, that can't be understood by the average person in the street trying to, figure out, why do I need to do X, Y, or Z when, I walk across the border and I don't have to do any of these things. So is the pandemic over? I think the pandemic is over. I think it is endemic now, but we are still seeing some of the impacts of the virus on the industry, and I think that's likely to continue.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a specific question on that from Hong Kong, where recently a policy of 0+3 was introduced, which means no quarantine, but 3 days of medical surveillance. Do you think that's sufficient to restore confidence and travel to Hong Kong?
No, I don't. I'm sorry, but people, particularly from a business point of view, aren't going to travel, and we've seen that. There's plenty of evidence now to support what happens when these restrictions are in place. Will people take the risk? Will people travel when they have to go into quarantine? And it's very clear. You're not going to get a recovery to normal behavior while these restrictions are in place. And I have huge sympathy for Hong Kong, and for the airlines there, particularly Cathay and the airports. Fantastic. These are global brands who have been significantly damaged as a result of the measures that are put in place that are almost unique to the area, and difficult for people to understand when they can see the rest of the world operating, in effect operating normally, and people getting on with their lives and people getting back to, the way it used to be. So I don't think, okay, going in the right direction, but is it going to make a huge difference? No, I don't believe it will.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a couple of questions in another area, which is operational difficulties. And we've got two questions talking about the situation at Amsterdam and Heathrow. And they're asking, what's our reaction, particularly to the cutbacks on flights at Schiphol last week? What kind of conversations is IATA having with the government? And do you expect this chaos to continue?
So I think it's good that you asked the question specifically in relation to Schiphol and Heathrow, because I think chaos has been in effect confined to those two airports. We have seen other airports with challenges, but not on the same scale as we've witnessed at Schiphol, which has been a total mess. And again, I think the people at KLM and the airlines operating into Schiphol have been incredibly frustrated by the inability of the airport to get its act together. And it is the airport, and the same applies for Heathrow. Heathrow say it's ground handling. This is nonsense. As I said, all you have to do is look at Heathrow's own statistics, where they have to produce their performance statistics for security control, and they're abysmal. Heathrow figures have been disgraceful. I've never seen such a poor performance. So at the same time as they're saying this is all because of airlines, they have been unable to do the basic job that an airport is required to do, which is to provide adequate staffing at security checkpoints to enable the airline's customers to get from the check-in area to the airside area, and restricting flights because you don't have enough people to do security checks. It's terrible to see the damage that has been done as a result of this. But most other airports are fine. I've flown through many airports recently. Obviously, Geneva, where I'm based, airport's functioning extremely well. Have not encountered any delays, at the airport, or going through security. Very well managed. I've flown through Spain, Germany, Belgium, Ireland in the last few weeks, and generally okay. So it's getting better, but what we've seen at Schiphol is a mess. To talk about increasing capacity and then reducing capacity, and all of this being done at short notice is incredibly difficult for airlines to deal with. So, you know, let's hope that Heathrow and Schiphol can get their act together. I see Schiphol has got rid of their CEO. You know, to be honest, it was inevitable. I think that would happen. Let's see what happens at Heathrow.
Okay, thank you, Willie. We have a slightly more broad question where the questioner asks, given the darkening economic picture, inflation, currency fluctuations, rising interest rates, are your recovery targets or expectations too ambitious?
I don't think they're overly ambitious. I think they reflect what it is we're seeing at the moment, and obviously things can change. But some of these challenges, you know, we have faced before. Our chief economist, Maury Owen Thompson, has pointed out on a number of occasions, which I think is important, that these challenges come at a time when we're seeing high employment levels, which is different to when we had seen some of these challenges previously. Now, I accept that you know, we're seeing high oil prices and high inflation coming pretty much at the same time. We've seen both of these at separate times. You know, the impact that it'll have on consumers, you know, will be significant. There's no question about that. You know, in some countries more than in others. But at the same time, the levels of employment around the world are generally very, very high and continue to be strong. So I think we're being realistic at the moment. You know, there clearly is concerns as to how long these challenges will persist. You would expect the inflation challenge probably to start diminishing, particularly if most central banks or governments, you know, respond as they appear to be with increasing interest rates to try and, you know, keep inflation a little bit in check anyway. And, you know, we'll start cycling over the increases in the oil prices. So, you know, some of these issues I think are temporary in nature. Some of them I think will persist for some time longer. But in the main, we still got to recognize that we're recovering still in terms of demand. So, you know, if I look at July and August, where international travel is only at 75% of where we were at 2019. So there's still room to go there. Year to date, to the end of August, we're probably at about 65%. So there's still a path to recover, which means that there's, you know, more opportunities for airlines in the certainly in the short term, and that opportunity will help to offset some of these challenges. But, you know, I don't underestimate the you know, the headache that all of these issues are causing airline management teams right across the world. But at least it's in an environment where the demand for the product remains strong.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a few more questions on climate change. One question says that we're seeing more climate skeptic governments in countries like the UK, Italy, etc. Does that concern you with respect to the industry's net zero commitments?
No, absolutely not, because it's not going to change the focus of the industry. And, you know, the difference here is we look at long-term targets. Governments in most countries tend to look at this week. You know, what's the polling say tomorrow about our performance? You know, so their time frame and their objectives are very different to the industry. So, you know, we're looking to 2050. They're looking to 2050 tonight. So it's a very different scenario, and it's not going to impact on our ambition, our determination, or you know, I think ultimately long term, you know, getting the governments aligned in terms of the need to address climate change, no matter how skeptical they are. Because while there may be, you know, some politicians who are skeptical, the vast majority of people around the world recognize that this is a challenge that has to be addressed.
Okay. And we talked a little bit about some countries that may have some concerns over the LTAG, but there are a couple of questions that are asking, you know, can you characterize what you see might be the blockers to achieving an LTAG at this assembly? And you said that anything less than LTAG would be a failure, but what Is there any compromise that could be done, or sort of how would you characterize the discussion around LTAC, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The reason I say it'll be a failure is it'll be another 3 years before the Assembly gets together again, and I don't think we have 3 years to wait for governments to align around a common goal for 2050. You know, we can see that there's impatience around the world. People want to see everybody move faster. You know, we recognise that at IATA and the industry in general, where we had previously agreed a target of a 50% net reduction by 2050, and that was clearly out of line, had become out of line with where the science was and where the Paris Agreement had got to. So we realigned our ambition with the science, and we recognise that may be the case going forward as well. So I don't think we have another 3 years, and that's why I think it will be important that this Assembly comes together and agrees on this goal. And it's difficult as an industry when you're bringing competitors together to try and agree on a common target on environmental issues. I wouldn't in any way underplay how challenging it was for us to get the airline industry to agree. So I think if an industry that is brutally competitive and looks at every opportunity to beat one another can reach an agreement, I think governments can do the same as well. So I've no doubt there will be some difficult conversations taking place, but we need to shine the spotlight where it should be shined, and that's on governments to reach this agreement. And beyond this, as I said, we need to start shining the spotlight on things that governments can do to improve the performance. And I will continue to highlight things like the structural inefficiency in air traffic control. We know in Europe, for example, if the single European sky was introduced, it could reduce CO2 emissions in Europe by 10 to 12%, or industry CO2 emissions by 10 to 12%. And the technology exists today. Airlines have already spent the money to be able to comply with the single European skies, and it's being held up by politicians. So, if we're serious about these targets, and we in the industry are, then we need to start taking action to deliver on them. So I'm, as I said earlier, I'm 4 out of 5 in terms of optimism, which for me, is pretty good. I'm 5 out of 5 in terms of determination. And if ICAO fails, it's not going to stop us in the industry, but you can be absolutely clear, we will be critical of people. We will shine the spotlight where it needs to be shined, and we will call out those who are forcing our industry to do things that are inefficient, and we can't afford that anymore.
Okay, great. We have a few minutes left, and there are a couple of non-ICAO related questions, so perhaps we try and take them in quick succession. The first is, are Russian airlines still members of IATA, and is IATA giving any consideration to their ongoing membership?
So we have airlines in Russia who are members. We have not removed any airlines from membership. Airlines can be removed from membership under certain circumstances, and particularly in relation to their compliance with the IOSA requirements, which is a safety requirement. If they don't comply with that, well, then they can't continue to be members. So we keep the situation under review. We condemn what's happening in Ukraine. We want to see that war ended. It's terrible to see the suffering that we have witnessed there, and I'm sure, like nearly everybody else, wants to see us return to a normal environment where we're all working together in a peaceful coexistence, which I think has to be the goal.
Great, thank you. Next question references the statements that we made at the annual general meeting in Doha about undeclared lithium batteries. Has there been any progress since the AGM, and is that an issue that will be raised at the Assembly here?
Yes, it is an issue that will be raised at the Assembly. Progress has been slow in relation to this. It is a critical issue. Airlines, we're not the police. This is where regulators need to take steps to ensure that these behaviours are eliminated, and the regulators need to ensure that they're taking all relevant steps. So we will be looking to ICAO and regulators around the world to improve performance in relation to this issue.
Okay, we have a question about industry debt. The airlines have accumulated debt. Interest rates are rising. In the future, do you see this as being a potential issue for the airlines in being able to pay back their debt?
Yeah, it's an issue, but interest rates are still well below inflation. So in effect, that's not saying it's a positive, but inflation certainly helps when it comes to managing your debt. So it's not a particular challenge at the moment. I don't think we need to be too concerned about that. I think airlines will be taking prudent action to repair their balance sheets. But in the current environment, I don't see it as being a major challenge.
Okay. A few weeks ago, we discussed in one of these press briefings the situation in Israel, where 4-engine aircraft were announced to be banned from next year. The questioner says, do we believe this is justified? Has anything happened since the announcement? What is IATA's position?
Yeah, I don't believe it's justified. Our position is that it should be based on science, and the idea that you just say 4 engines are bad, and I don't think it's as simple as that. I think if you want to take measures like this, it needs to be done on the basis of a full assessment of the situation to understand both the challenge and to understand the right measures that can be taken to address that challenge. So we will be encouraging people to stand back and to do a detailed assessment and explain the measures that have been taken and the expected result that those measures will lead to.
Okay, and then the last question is, during the pandemic, there was lots of discussions about a health passport or health credentials. Does IATA have any view on that, and will that issue come up at the Assembly?
I think having better means of addressing additional requirements is certainly a positive. We learned a lot going through this pandemic. Relying on paperwork to prove your identity or your status is just impossible in the current way of operating. So we need digital solutions that provide seamless travel for customers, and let's try and get a simple and common solution so that people know what they're required to do, and it's not rocket science, and there's no reason why governments can't work together to agree on a standard that enables people to provide their identity in a digital manner if that's what they were. In the same way as we have a standard for a passport. You don't need 193 different standards. Let's try and work together to get a simple common solution so that going forward we can deal with these issues in a much more streamlined way.
Okay, Willie, and then the last question would just be 2 weeks from now at the end of this Assembly next Friday. What do you think the position will be, and will we be celebrating, or will we be moving on to different challenges? Where do you think the industry will be at the end of this Assembly?
Yeah, we certainly won't be celebrating. There's not a lot for us to celebrate in the current environment other than the fact that we are making progress. But if ICAO agrees to a long-term aspirational goal of net zero by 2050, I'll say well done. Certainly not going to celebrate it because it's the minimum that's required. As I've said, anything less than that I will consider a failure. And we've lots of other challenges that we need to get on with, and there's a lot of work that we need to do. So this is another important step in achieving what is a critical goal. I'm hopeful that ICAO will reach agreement, but as I said, I don't think it'll be any reason for celebrating it. I think it'll be ticked off as good job done. Let's move on to the next challenge.
Great. On that note, thank you very much. Thank you to all those who have joined. Please follow developments over the next couple of weeks. We will be putting out a press release later on today, which will outline some of our other papers that we have here before the Assembly. And at the end of the Assembly, as is tradition, we're planning to report on how we see the results of it. So please keep following for the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much. I wish you all a good rest of your day and rest of the week.